All right, so it looks like it's recording. I'm Jeremy Terrell, and with me is Nathaniel Rivers.
Hello.
Hi. So this is the pilot of the research project we're doing. And we won't get into too much detail with that here, since this is supposed to be sort of as these video discussions would unfold. But it has to do with examining Amazon's Mechanical Turk service rhetorically to see how it parses up human agency from machine agency, essentially, or intelligence, right, in its own language. Because it uses in fact, the acronym Human Intelligence Tasks to discuss its wares, I suppose, its tasks. So it's inviting an examination of what is human intelligence in this thing. And it's useful because it's a very sort of pragmatic economic look at that, right? Because what Amazon's Mechanical Turk is, drawing from the metaphor of the Mechanical Turk, which was originally a chess-playing automaton that actually had a small person inside it. What the service actually is a place where people can post tasks that, for whatever reason, are menial but don't suit machine automation. So these are conventionally things like identifying if a picture contains a dog in it, or if two written descriptions are talking about the same product, or something like that. They can post these tasks. A distributed pool of people can take them up, and they are compensated generally in very, very modest ways. I mean, we're talking pennies per task, but then they are very sort of menial rote things. So sort of the premise of our work, and we're working on the abstract here, is examining this corpus of such tasks, right? Because they're constructed through text. I mean, it's perfect fodder for rhetoric, to see how they are parsing up the human from the non-human agent. It's interesting, I think, also to look at these kind of mundane things, because most of the time it seems like we parse up the human from the non-human agent in very grandiose ways, some sort of intellectual capability like genius or intuition, or in some instances, a kind of moral or ethical difference, right? But here we can actually look at these mundane things that are very concrete for distinctions between human and non-human agents. So that's a thumbnail sketch of it. Is that fair, Nathaniel?
That was good. I'm on board with that.
I've been teaching online, so I'm still wearing the tie and everything.
Mm-hmm.
I literally just paused from it. So at the stage we are right now, we are working on the abstract. And part of this project is we did want to collaborate in a shared public way, right? So ideally, in a way where people can see our work as it develops, can visit these online video discussions and participate. There is an open chat capability with this. In ways, we are exploring a kind of partnership between human and non-human agents through the act of doing this. And we're also doing research in a sort of visible way that I think is different, right? Literally, we'll be able to see something as it's being built, be able to look at the draft as it's being assembled, which is terrifying, obviously, but we'll see how it goes. So that's the stage where we are now. And I whipped together this abstract of the project and sort of the production angle of it as well. And Nathaniel, you had sort of one central thing, and I'm going to share my screen here since I've got that pulled up. Maybe you can walk me through the sort of points you made here.
Yeah. So the point I was making, as is mentioned early in the abstract, not a lot of work being done on this within rhetorical studies. In case Jeremy mentioned earlier that that it's happening in adjacent fields. So kind of thinking as I was reading through the abstract, thinking about how I think it's compelling argument alone that this should be of interest to rhetoric in the ways that Jeremy just outlined. But also thinking about the terms that were showing up in the abstract and the ways in which those could be used as kind of additional hooks or ways in for a possible audience. So if they might not necessarily be interested in Mechanical Turks and what rhetoric would have to say about that, what would a project about mechanical Turks disclose about other areas of rhetoric? So the term that shows up a lot, even in Jeremy's just thumbnail of the project, is sort of this notion of human agency and what marks sort of uniquely human agency as compared to non-human agency. And when the conversation about mechanical Turks is cast in those terms, it's much more legible to rhetoric, which is very much always thinking through these questions, and has always thought these questions. In many ways, agency might be a kind of central aspect in rhetoric, and questions about what agency a rhetor has in any given situation, and how agency ties to efficacy, and all those kinds of questions.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's good. The question of agency. I mean, the thing we may need to parse out is the distinction between maybe intelligence and agency, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, you're right. Those are both probably ways in. And as you suggest, and as we've sort of preliminary discussed, it was tricky to try and find stuff squarely in rhetorical studies that specifically address this particular service. And, I searched through our online databases, Google Scholar, and then just individual journals. And I've been able to find literally nothing specifically about Mechanical Turk, which gives me the willies, because there's got to be something, right?
It's quiet, almost too quiet.
Exactly. I mean, and there's stuff. It's an interesting topic, as you point out, sort of because of the adjacent. There's a book about using Mechanical Turk for academics. And if you kind of look, and I don't think it has the TOC immediately there, but it's basically sort of practical. Here's how you do it in order to do research. Because, and this is an angle that is in the abstract a little bit, that one of the main usages now of Amazon's Mechanical Turk is in social science research. So things like where you used to have a pool of undergraduates, Psych 101, go take this survey and tell us, how you feel about this or that. Now you post this on Mechanical Turk and you get people from hypothetically all over to take these surveys. And so there's not only sort of the pragmatics of doing it, right, that we can see in all kinds of different journals, judgment and decision making, right, that are adjacent to rhetoric. But then there's also, understandably, a little bit of hand-wringing about that practice, right?
I would think so.
Yeah, about, not only just what do we get out of, I mean, is that skewed? But then also questions of how exploitative that is, right? There are some here, like a data-driven analysis of workers' earnings. And then, of course, in something middlebrow like The Atlantic, how the internet is enabling a new kind of poorly paid hell, right?
Yeah.
So there's this sort of range of questions and investigations about there's at least sort of three levels here. One, studies just straight up using M-Turk, right? Social studies, business, right? And we see some of these just straight up using it. Two, work about sort of how to do that is still scholarly, and kind of the pragmatics of administering it and questions about doing that. And then sort of a third level of, wait, what about doing this? Sort of these questions of, is it exploitative? Does it skew data? Sort of the meta layer there. And so these things are there, and particularly that last one about exploitation, and that sort of skews into the humanities, where these others are, organizational and business and social science, right?
Yeah. And what's interesting too is to think about those labor issues, right? That what makes it exploitive, I think, is in large part, right, how they're compensated and how these, and I don't know enough about this yet, but even how they skirt issues of minimum wage and things like that, right? That what kind of things are being set up to avoid those kinds of payments. But is it also deemed exploitive because of the kind of labor that it is, right? That expectations that, well, a computer could do that. So if you have a human being doing it all day, does that make it even additionally, right? If these were well-paid positions, that might make all the willies go away, but it might not either.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there are these sorts of related issues, and I think you're right. We'll have to parse out specifically what we're talking about, and find our way in, particularly as there, I think it's fair to say, at least there's not a robust examination of this service squarely within rhetoric studies. We'll have to sort of draw that circle a little bit wider and maybe look at rhetoric studies that, as you pointed out, talk about other forms of automation potentially in agency. Like, what were some of the others that you were maybe bringing up?
So there's the famous essay by Carolyn Miller about I think the title is "What Automation Can Teach Us About Agency."
Mm-hmm.
And she imagines a hypothetical scenario, I think, involving robo-grading. So that would be the big one in rhet comp, particularly composition, is the use of computers to grade writing is a big sticking point for lots of compelling reasons. But she uses that to think about how human beings make attributions of agency, and how those attributions of agency sort of produce rhetorical effects in terms of what kinds of automation we are willing or unwilling to accept. And so she primarily thinking about sort of non-human agency as something that's attributed to non-humans by humans. But automation is the main paradigm she uses to think through questions of how agency is attributed. And she kind of uses an automated robo-grader as a kind of limit case for how far we're willing to go to grant agency, or she points out rhetorical agency,
Mm-hmm.
to something like a computer. And she's also pretty clear in that article and in a few other places, really parsing out the difference between agency and rhetorical agency, right? So it's one thing to grant agency to an inanimate object or an animal. It's another thing to grant it rhetorical agency. Her argument being is that oftentimes people who want to grant or attribute agency in non-humans blur those a little bit. So if we give something agency, we kind of automatically give it rhetorical agency. And she's much more interested in maintaining that distinction. Because for her, rhetorical agency then suggests certain forms of accountability and responsibility. And so once you start assigning agency away from humans, her, I think, worry is that then those humans become less responsible for their rhetorical activity.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that may speak to this distinction of, do we want to focus on agency or some form of intelligence or selfhood, right? I mean, is that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, that would be, I mean, I think parsing those out would itself be a project, because in many ways, if you start looking at what people's definitions of agency are, particularly rhetorical or human agency, it's just become synonym soup at that point, right? They'll use intelligence or selfhood or consciousness, or, right? In many ways, a lot of terms that get used when you have debates about artificial intelligence and Turing tests and all those kinds of things. So oftentimes agency becomes this kind of clearinghouse term for a bunch of other criteria for the human.
Right. Well, so what do you think about a way to maybe focus this? What are your thoughts about maybe how we can focus this down?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean,
I'm not here to provide answers.
That's a good question for the pilot. I mean, I think actually what's interesting for me, I think particularly given the idea of building a corpus that's going to be describing these tasks, that I think one thing that might be interesting, both from the standpoint of doing the research itself and maybe the argument of the piece, is actually to maybe leave undecided what those are, and to actually, right, how is agency getting defined implicitly or explicitly through these descriptions of these tasks?
Okay.
Right. That in many ways, I think what we're actually interested in is not, we have a notion of agency, and does the Turk project work with that or not? Is I actually think what's interesting about this project is how it actually parses that for itself through the iterative practice of describing these tasks. Right. So what understanding of agency could we glean from these things? And does that notion of agency then, right, where does it tend towards, right? Does the moments in those ads that feel like they're describing human agency, are those moments that seem like more interested in intelligence, or are they more interested in imagination, or are they more interested in judgment, right? So
And see,
What?
these are good conversations. I'm not sorry for butting in on you.
No.
These are good conversations because we haven't at this point started to assemble that corpus. But when we do, we're going to have to start thinking about how are we classifying stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, are we just like looking for synonyms for stuff, or are we going to be classifying them, as you say, along lines of something like, well, mechanical skill versus intuitive? I mean, you know, are we going to, and some of that we're going to have to look at a preliminary body of descriptions to
Right.
even figure out, you know, okay, well, do those because those categories are going to have to come bottom up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that'll be interesting. I'm even thinking, even just since this conversation, right, the ways in which this is a labor issue, right, raises all sorts of interesting distinctions about how labor gets understood in terms of blue collar versus white collar, right? Well, the scheme we come up with to organize this reinscribe those distinctions between intellectual work versus mechanical work. I mean, that already, right? I was kind of suggesting that, and then you repeated it, like alarm bells went off in my head. Like, what's the distinction between a intelligent act and a more mechanical one, right? That already gets complicated.
It does. I mean, although my sympathies are kind of with not having that distinction, because I think maybe one thing this can do for us is help obviate that distinction. Because if we draw a line between, no, these are all things that humans do, it changes your axis, right? The axis is no longer, is this menial and rote, or is this, I'm using my mind? If we put the line between, no, this is what makes a human agent, all of a sudden, all of those things, the menial, the creative, you know, whatever, they then become that category, right? You no longer have this kind of potentially demeaning, well, you're just a rote worker and I'm a mind worker. Now we just have these are things that humans do in relief to the machine, you know?
Yeah. These are things that, and what's really interesting too about this is because the nature of the work, it seems like everything about the Mechanical Turk is begrudging. Right? I'd rather have a computer do this. I'd rather have a machine do it, but they can't yet. So I need you people.
Well, and what's curious about this is a lot, particularly the initial work, but a lot of what people are doing on Mechanical Turk are actually training AI. So for example, they'll have a task where you have to identify, is there a picture in this dog? What they're actually doing is building up a body of, okay, these are all dog pictures. Let's run this through the machine. You know, in a sense, if you're a Platonist, you're training the thing that's killing you in a way, right?
Right. Yeah.
Training your replacement in some ways, quite literally. And that does sort of address, I mean, I was saying Platonist glibly, but I'm not super enthusiastic about framing this in terms of, well, what's left for humans? You know, what are the scraps that we have? And there's a couple of problems with that. And one of them is it keeps, you know, kind of forcing us into this weird, you know, pseudo rarefied air of, well, no, but we're still magically special because of, you know, this great ethical responsibility or whatever. And I'm not super sympathetic to that. I mean, as I put in the abstract, I'd more like to view this as systemically, how do human and non-human agents collaborate, right? Yeah. I mean, how do we function appropriately to make the system potentially more effective? And granted, any qualifier, I mean, what do I mean by better or more effective? I mean, I understand that, but
yeah. I think our post-human bona fides are proven. I mean, anyways, right, this goes back to our first collaboration, right? The piece we wrote about Andy Clark and the term that he uses throughout the Natural Born Cyborgs is he uses the term merger, which suggests, right, that this question of where the human ends and where something else begins is the much less interesting question, right? The much more interesting question is, how do these mergers going to take place and what will the consequences and implications be of particular mergers? But the idea that there's a way to cordon off and preserve the human in some way is that for Clark, right, that ship, that was already over, right? The defining feature of humans is precisely the fact that we were never humans unto ourselves.
Yes, that we've never been autonomous. We've always been imbricated with language or place or...
Yeah, I think like you, for me, the much more interesting and I think rhetorical question is what kinds of practices get developed here, as opposed to what kinds of philosophical categories get reinscribed or, right? I mean, ultimately, I think the Mechanical Turk is, this is work that someone needs to do, and how do we go about doing that in a way that, I don't know, leverages the particular capacities of different kinds of bodies, human and non-human, or whatever terminology we might get used, right? That, and I think this goes back to your more early point too, right? That oftentimes when we start talking about the distinction between humans and non-humans, I think the certain kind of post-humanist discourse gets misread as saying there's no difference. And I think probably the better way of saying it is, I think a kind of post-human perspective is there's not one big one. There's thousands of smaller ones or medium-sized ones, right? There's no big difference. There's lots of tiny ones that are hugely significant, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, what's the difference between a cat and a lamp? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, and it does suggest, I mean, that there's this sort of axis or something, right? That divides there. And right, I mean, what I'm kind of interested here is parsing out what's characteristically human, even though that may be shifting or whatever, but it's sort of in potentially potentially Rhetorian or potentially another means, a way of tracing kind of the things in the system and seeing, but what are they, what gives us a sort of loose boundary to put on, well, this is what a human characteristic. If we talk about things as that kind of category, then we need to have sort of, okay, well, then here's what's characteristic of them, knowing that it's porous, of course.
Yeah. It would only be characteristic of them in this particular network.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that's, I mean, looking at this corpus may, it sort of puts those boundaries on it. Right.
Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, in concrete terms of the abstract, should we then start thinking of those kinds of things about in rhetoric dealing with agency and potentially automation or those kinds? And see, the problem there potentially is we'll have to get a smaller circle, because if we just say, well, post-human agency and rhetoric, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So we'll have to think, what particularly should we be looking, should we now turn to in terms of the abstract,
Yeah. I think
conversation
I think the kind of automation, I think the big one, at least disciplinarily, and again, this sort of hinges on the kind of rhet-comp relationship there, is, I think, the move in education to move towards the kind of machine grading of writing, which involves, training, how do you got to basically teach, how do you teach a computer pedagogy, so that can then assess writing. And there is some stuff on that. So Jim Brown and Janelle Johnson have a piece in the Latour collection, the final chapter, that's the kind of Aramay style piece about where the sort of machine grader talks, and it actually recognizes a student's biology exam, and then it reads their English exam and is disappointed by it. That might be a potential way in, because I think that issue has the additional resonance of also being a kind of labor issue, right? That who's being asked to do what. I don't know. That would be my instinct now, as a way of that focus on automation brings in all these larger post-human issues, but it gives us a concrete thing to look at, and a concrete thing that has lots of overlap with Mechanical Turks. I mean, one could imagine an English teacher going to Mechanical Turks and be like, can you grade these essays for me? Right. I mean, grading is a kind of task that we might offload onto this.
Yeah. That's it. I mean, that's interesting, because I'm, reminded of, it's Texas Tech, right? That had, was it Icon? Mm-hmm. The distributed grading model of the teachers wouldn't necessarily be grading the work of their students, right? That it would be entered in. I sure hope it was Texas Tech and Icon.
Yeah.
The idea was all student work was entered into this giant pool. It would be graded by more than one grader or commenter, who, there's no guarantee it would be your instructor, but the idea was this sort of distributed model. In a sense, Mechanical Turk could be that writ large in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And with interesting kind of, I think partially what motivated that was the idea of kind of separating grading from the teaching of writing. So I mean, it had some kind of, it wasn't simply for the sake of efficiency, but actually the sake of kind of, from a certain writing pedagogy standpoint, I think a pretty persuasive argument that the grading of writing is oftentimes antithetical to the actual responding to and commenting on writing. So if you could offload the grading on somebody else, it would kind of, it would keep the instructor in a much more,
Yeah.
it
An
wouldn't dirty
instructor rather than a
instructor. Yeah.
And of course, I mean, the idea that if multiple people see it, you're getting a richer slice of feedback than, a very narrow one person. Yeah.
Right. So I don't think they do that anymore. I think that's officially dead there. I don't know.
Yeah. Though it might be worthwhile checking and seeing. I mean, I'm going to jot that down with robo grading. And see, this is the kind of thing where we're this public and people listening to this, they could maybe help us out with that.
They could chime in. Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of a distributed, because there we were dealing with humans in collaboration with a machine system, nearly identical in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder too if that's part of how we position it too. That in many ways, the mechanical Turk is just a really intense version of essentially how we're already working, right? I mean, even if you're not using what Texas Tech was using, if you're using Canvas or Blackboard or Drupal, right? You're already in that sense, right? You're using Drupal to help aggregate student comments, right? Or something like that, right? It's those relationships already exist. It just seems like what Mechanical Turk is doing is it's like a concentrated version of it.
Yeah, so that'll be interesting. Now I'm wondering, will that relate to this concept of agency, or does it then become a pedagogical argument, or
that I don't know. That I mean that's kind of why I was sort of hedging my bets a little bit about sort of our starting point with respect to what work is being done on Mechanical Turk within Rhetoric.
Right.
But then lots of the examples I can think of are happening in composition,
right?
Which is related, but not always seamlessly. That if we go the comp angle, a lot of the tension around that is about pedagogy, but I do still think it's about agency. And even then, right, the Mechanical Turk, as you've mentioned before, is pedagogical, right? A lot of the work being done there is teaching AI how to do things. So
yeah. Well, so I mean, we don't have to make a decision, but I mean, if it gives us potential buckets, right, about looking sort of with robo grading, I mean, would that be an appropriate kind of, because I mean, I think possibly what we're looking for here is the conversation that we're going to be joining, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, is that the conversation? Is there something maybe in Rhetoric that's dealing with machine intelligence? Potentially that's a conversation we would join alternately, because I don't think we want to try and stitch all of these together because it'll become too unmanageable. But I mean, is there a machine intelligence conversation that potentially has to do explicitly with intelligence or agency that we could look up? I mean, even if it's not talking about Mechanical Turk, because the pickings seem sort of slim there, but stuff in Red studies that is at least considering AI and machine intelligence and those kinds of things explicitly.
Yeah.
So that might be another way to look. And, we may or may not, I'm sure we'll find stuff, the danger there would be getting the phone book, I mean, you'll get too much stuff for it to be feasible, but maybe not,
Yeah. But I think there's ways of, and I think that the language of entering the conversation, right? Who are we talking to? Because it can't be people who have just been waiting finally for two knuckleheads in Rhetoric to write about Mechanical Turks, right? It's got to be we're speaking to and about Mechanical Turks, but we're also speaking to not something larger, but something that's more
applicable, I suppose, beyond just
Mechanical Turks, right? Yeah. The payoff of our article isn't we finally figured out Mechanical Turks.
Yeah.
But that working through Mechanical Turks and the way we're going to work through it informs other, I mean, even just like digital rhetoric itself, right? Is that maybe just a larger umbrella that we're working under? And then, yeah, and now I'm drawing a blank on stuff that I know exists.
Well, it's because you're on camera.
Yeah. But I know Casey Boyle has I think it's an RSQ about sense commons.
Right.
So, and I think stuff, the RSQ special issue, it was in the RSQ special issue about wearables, right? And the idea that in part his argument was somewhat different from the other ones, is that actually with respect to sort of cities and smart cities, that the human being itself is the wearable for the city, that human beings become
right.
sensors that feed data back. And that's in that sense, you could understand the argument there as human beings become mechanical Turks for policy, or right, that he's got this notion of pervasive citizenship is potentially a kind of mechanical Turk, right? That you go out and use your Fitbit to collect data about city streets, or, you know, but
Well,
what you're doing is you're basically doing a kind of routine Turk work for generating data that the city can use then to make policy decisions.
Well, see, and that's interesting because this work actually comes from a talk I did a while ago about literacy, and sort of building off different forms of, we were print, and then Ulmer and electricity, and that we've shifted from being the readers to the read. That was essentially the point of my talk, was that it was called Mechanical Turks in an Era of Techno Illiteracy or something. I don't remember. I should have looked it up for this. But the idea was that we've shifted from being the readers of symbols to the symbols that are read by, in this case, machine readers.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's something we wanted to try and use, then yeah, something like Casey's work, and I would be able to return to my original talk, because it could go then in that lineage of shifts in literacy, from decrypting written symbols or electric symbols toward, now there's a position shift. Potential problem, well, not a problem, but a potential effect of that is it does run the risk of, well, we're out of the catbird seat now, right? I mean, now we're just and maybe Casey, I bet, had to engage with this. That doesn't necessarily reduce us to, the dumb things just feeding the overarching AI, right? I mean, but you have to kind of acknowledge, I would suppose, we're not being pushed out of the place of cognitive supremacy. We're just assuming a different role in this network.
Yeah. Yeah. The merger's different. Or the, yeah.
Yeah. So that might be a separate bucket. So, I mean, maybe what we can do is do a little poking around in those areas. And I jotted down, I think, 3 of them, the sort of comp bucket of robo-grading, if that's a potential way to go. And, in frankness, I mean, it's very possible that the corpus itself may suggest one or the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another bucket being this question of machine intelligence or artificial intelligence in rhetoric studies, questions explicitly of agency or intelligence. And then lastly, this notion of a kind of literary, I don't know, just literacy tradition of becoming a kind of agent that is, at this point, read, contributing to a kind of superorganism. Now, I suppose the good news on that, though, is it's not like that hasn't always been the case, right? I mean, the polis is that, right? I mean,
right.
It's a superorganism. So, I mean, it's possible to say, look, it's not like now we're just sitting there while, Google gives us custom fed advertisements and we're just, flesh packages getting catered to. It's always been this question of the network. It's just now different and visible, I suppose, in different ways.
Yeah, no, I I've been doing some research on attention and the ways in which it gets commodified, particularly online, right? The standard complaint about and this comment gets renewed anytime Facebook makes a big change, and then a bunch of people complain about Facebook changing, and then people complain about the people complaining, right? It's free. Why are you complaining? And then someone posts a picture of the pigs being led to the slaughterhouse, talking about how good all the food is, right? The idea that basically on Facebook, right, it's your attention is the commodity that's being mined by Facebook that they then go and turn to sellers, right? But that model of advertising and attention goes all the way back to newspapers at the turn of the century, right? That you start giving away newspapers for free because you're not the news is not the content you're selling. The news is the thing you put out to attract people's attention, which is actually the thing that you're selling to advertisers.
And it's possible that that's also the commodity in the Mechanical Turk as well. I mean, the examples I mentioned, right? Things like, is there a dog in this? I mean, potentially that's the unit of labor is my attention to do a rote task, right? Yep. Dog. So that might be a way in, and that might be a way in potentially that we're a little more conversant.
Yeah.
In the sense of, other work is already sort of doing that. So that might be a way in this question of the network and what we contribute to it. I maybe.
Yeah. And also how the network is then shaping that relationship to it too. So, right. So it's not just that Mechanical Turk is right. I have attention and it needs it. But it's also asking me to cultivate a particular kind of attention as well. And which may or may not be something that we recognize as uniquely human attention. Right. So that gets us back, I think, to those questions as well.
Yeah. Well, so what do you think? What's the next step for the abstract, at least? Do we want to poke around on those, or
a little bit? I mean, in part, my comment on here was mainly just specific to the abstract itself, which I kind of quite like as is. I mean, I don't, you know what I mean? It's sort of, and in part too, I don't know how to add this into the abstract without the abstract becoming something much more than an abstract.
What would have to be is just as I've done in the other place in the abstract, kind of a name check dump, right?
Yeah, that's basically like a parenthetical here that's just cites whatever,
things talking about agency and the ways we'd maybe like to talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that might be the way, because yes, I mean, as you say, this is an abstract, which I was shooting for. Right now it's about a page. I was shooting for short. It's, a little bit complicated because it's not just the subject of what we're doing, but it's also this process that we're going through, making it visible and collaborative.
Yeah, which I think is another reason too to not spend too much time on the abstract at this point.
Yeah.
Because in many ways we want to get the abstract out somewhat well in advance of what we're doing, so that what we're doing here becomes part of.
Right. Yes.
So. Yeah, right, we've already got one episode that's off the grid that we would like the episode to be on.
But maybe this is a an unreleased. Maybe this is an episode 0. Who knows?
Yeah, and
subscribers bonus.
And then when Netflix hosts it, it'll be episode 1, and it will confuse people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait a second. They make all these jokes again in episode 4. That's because this was not an episode, and Netflix doesn't label those properly.
Digression about Netflix. We got a bone to pick with you, Netflix.
It's all Mechanical Turk, right? The way that it uses our preferences to organize itself.
Well, not to get off on a tangent, but yeah, there was, and there may still be, a contest that that Netflix would hold, where you could try and beat their algorithm, basically making a better algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
I actually worked up an idea for that, although it was terrible. It was a terrible idea.
This is another tangent, and then we'll stop. I wanted to teach a film class that was just Netflix, where the class would go through. We'd have an account for the class, and I think maybe I would pick it or something. We would pick the first movie, and then we would aggregate our votes and either give it, I forget, Netflix changed from stars to thumbs up. And then we would watch whatever Netflix recommended based on that.
Mm-hmm.
So that the whole class would basically be a class about film, but mostly a class about, distribution and attention, that the class would let Netflix tell us what to watch next based on our collective response to what we'd previously watched.
That's interesting, because I had that 150 person online Netflix class, but we did not do that. Man, it would be good for the number of students, but that'd be like herding cats upon cats.
We could just pay someone to do it on Amazon's Mechanical Turks.
Yes, use Mechanical Turk to game the results.
Now, at some point, are we going to use Mechanical Turks for this project?
We're going to have to, in order to get access to the corpus. You sort of have, we don't necessarily have to do the tasks or post the tasks. We could do that. I would suggest we should do some of the tasks to get a feel for it. But you do have to essentially have an account in order just to get the info.
And I'm real good at spotting stop signs.
Yeah.
At one time when I ran one and I got into a crash.
Well, that's where all that stuff comes from, probably. I mean, those were probably trained by Turkers.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's do that. Let's maybe individually find some sources that potentially we could plug into this, where you've put the comment there, a parenthetical that addresses agency here. And of course, we're not going to be wedded to that, but it'll give us at least something to shop around, I guess.
Yeah, I think it just lets people know what the ballpark is. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll do that. Yeah, and our time's probably drawing to a close here, so we'll do that, and then we can just add it to this Google Doc, and then we can go from there.
Okay.
All right. Sounds good. I don't know how to end this. Apparently. All right. We'll do that, and I'll see you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.